Anin Boujou, welcome to part 2 of the Havin Nunavut lecture series. We're going to be taking a look at the question, are we managers, stewards, or community members? And this is one of the essential questions I really think we need to ask. We're going to be going through, taking a look at some of the places that the management/stewardship mentality has led us, and then wrap up with a little bit peek into that idea of being a community member or relative, which will lead us into part 3 of Havin Nunavut. All right, you ready? Because I'm excited. All right, so when we're taking look at these 3 ideologies, 3 different philosophies of how we relate to the land: stewardship, resource management, and the traditional ecological knowledge route, or TEK, which includes very complex philosophies. Didn't know how to summarize it all together, so all of relations / belonging to the land / democracy of species, which is something we'll be taking a look at in part 3 more closely, particularly with the democracy of species, and in other lectures we'll, of course, all of relations and belonging to the land figure in prominently as well, but our focus for part 3 will be democracy of species. So when we take a look at stewardship, the idea of stewardship, like from the part 1 of Havin Nunavut lecture here, the concept of stewardship is that you have the office of being a steward. You have the office of being someone who's put in charge to take care of things. You are the administrator, the manager. You take care of something for its own good. So stewardship is about taking care of the earth, land, plants, animals for their own good. So again, stewardship is about putting us into a position of authority, a position of knowing what's best, drawing on that whole concept of that wardship principle that was used by the United States government and other colonizing governments with other Indigenous peoples. It was used by the United States government with Native American peoples, specifically discussed in American law as the Great White Father taking care of his red children, because the Native people were not seen as intelligent enough and capable enough of taking care of their own affairs. And I mentioned in part 1 also, Derek Jensen in The Myth of Human Supremacy points out, the problem with this is that we assume the people what we are managing for their own good don't know how to do that for themselves. And he says, forests know best how to raise a forest, buffalo know best how to raise buffalo, and so on and so forth. So there's a real conflict here. Stewardship is not about recognizing that buffalo know best how to raise buffalo. It is about saying, I'm going to take care of the buffalo. We are going to take care of the buffalo for their own good. We're going to manage them in the way that we know is best for them. Resource management is very similar to stewardship. It just is, I think, a little more apparent about where its philosophy is coming from. It is managing resources, we'll get back to that word in a second, for their own good, balanced with the demands of industry and what is called a social carrying capacity. So this is all about management, right? Administration, taking control, doing what is best. So this is different from stewardship. Stewardship takes care of the earth, land, plants, and animals with the idea that is meant to be for the good of those land, plants, and animals. That's the point of being a good steward, is you take care of them for their own good, but you're still in that position of authority to decide what that good is. Resource management manages resources, again I'll get back to that word resources in a second, manages the land, plants, and animals. Not only, it's partly for their own good, but resource management also balances out, well, what does industry need or demand, and what do human cultures who are in that same area as those land, plants, and animals, what do they tolerate, what are they willing to accept? So resource management is even more human-centric than stewardship is. Stewardship can be very much all about the planet, all about the land, all about animals, even though it puts humans in that position of authority and gives humans the power to decide what is for what the land, plants, and animals' own good is. That's what stewardship does. It gives us that authority, it gives us that prerogative, but it is still about the land, plants, and animals, whereas resource management has that as part of it, but it also is balancing out or listening to the demands of industry and whether or not people, just like the animals or like the forests that are there. And if there's significant popular opinion against an animal, or there's significant industrial demand to destroy a forest, a resource manager will say, it looks like there could be good economics for why we need to, put this mine in here, even though it means destroying a forest. Or it looks like we have human communities who are very, have a fear and hatred of this particular animal, even if it doesn't make sense in terms of biology or science. Their social carrying capacity won't allow more wolves than X number. Then we're going to have to destroy those wolves. And like I said, we talked about that in part 1 too, how when we start to decide whether or not a community likes something is a determining factor for whether or not that being gets to survive. We have a very problematic issue going on there. But anyway, resource management combines stewardship, but sublimates that idea of putting land, plants, and animals, taking care of them. It can sublimate that. It can put that as a secondary concern when industry concerns or communities concerns override the good and the welfare of the land, plant, or animal in question. That term resources, again, that's a problematic term in English. It objectifies beings. It objectifies animals. It objectifies plants. It objectifies the land. It makes all the world that is identified as resources appear to be as if it is the world consists of mere things which humans can take as they see fit. Maybe as they see fit is bound by resource management laws. Maybe it isn't, but the point is they are seen as things that humans can take as they see fit. They are things to be used for human consumption, for human use. Traditional ecological knowledge, by contrast, care is about caring for one's relations and minimizing one's impact on those relations. So, for whatever reason on Earth, all life has to live on other life in one way or another, whether you're living off of plants or you're living off of animals or both. Other life is giving to other life. And the point in TEK is that you care for that life that's giving this life for you. They're relatives, right? They are considered your equals and even your teachers, humanities teachers, the ones who have so much to tell us because we are one of the younger species here and we have so much yet to learn. But the idea is they are relations, they're not resources. They are relations, therefore they should be respected as fully sovereign beings, not as ones for whom we take charge of and manage according to what we think is their own good. We're not their great white fathers. So TEK sees other beings, plants, animals, the land, as relations, beings in their own right, with the right to full sovereignty, and as our actions as human beings, part of what we need to consider to live ethically is that we don't overly impinge, we don't overly impact in a negative way these relations of ours. So you can see 3 different approaches here to how we should relate to the earth. Stewardship is based on the wardship principle. Like we mentioned, paternalism, father knows best. There is an entitlement to stewardship because it assumes that humans have the right to control, manage, and take care of the land, plants, and animals as a caretaker. It's a benevolent entitlement, but it's still an entitlement nonetheless. What's interesting is stewardship also is based on the idea that man or humanity has dominion over the earth. This comes directly out of the Bible, of course. And again, as I mentioned, stewardship comes from that Christian concept of being the master gardener in God's garden. That as humans, we're put in charge of taking care of creation for God's sake. Right? So this is a position of authority and management. That's where stewardship comes from. But there are differences even within Christianity. St. Francis of Assisi, for example, who lived in the 1100s, and St. Benedict, who lived in the 500s. St. Benedict was a steward. He was a master gardener. He believed in gardening and taking care of the earth in a good way for the benefit of, being a good steward. Just, you take care of the earth and it will feed you, and that's what it means to be a good person. St. Francis of Assisi says, yeah, you take care of the earth, but not as this on high authority. St. Francis actually saw other beings as equals. There are different sources out there that talk about how St. Francis looked at the animals and saw them as equals, looked at, other beings as equals. So he was much more indigenous in his outlook than much of Christianity is. And that's a really important thing, I think, to mention. St. Francis is looked to as one of the patron saints of ecology. The other that I know of in terms of patron saint of nature is Kateri Tekakwitha, who was Haudenosaunee from back at the colonial times here in the United States. Or I think it might have even been before the U.S. was here. But anyway, St. Francis of Assisi is one of the patron saints of ecology, and he had a much more indigenous outlook towards so-called nature than did much of the rest of Christianity. Resource management, like stewardship, is also based on the wardship principle, father knows best, and it also has that sense of entitlement that humans have a right to use and manage the resources as science sees fit. So it is science-based, but it takes into account industry and social carrying capacity and tries to balance that out with the good of the land, good of the animal, but it's all based on that wardship, father knows best, paternalistic principle. TEK is based on seeing all of nature, quote-unquote nature, all beings as family, that they have the equality that family has. And it's based on the knowledge that your individual relations to these relatives is based on being rooted in a particular land. So you know these relations not just as wolf, not just as squirrel, not just as maple, but as that wolf. You know, maybe you have a name for a particular wolf or a wolf pack. You know that wolf pack. You know the cubs that they've had over the years. You know their movements and their habits. You know that maple forest. You know the old maples that are there. You know the ones that have fallen. You recognize the new ones that are coming. You know those particular relations in that particular area of land in which you live and have lived for generations. I have to emphasize this all the time. Many native people, such as the tribal people of North America, were not nomadic. Nomadic is a very different thing. The Maasai of Africa are nomadic. They follow their cattle herds. The Sami of Northern Europe are nomadic. They follow their reindeer herds. The Anishinaabe of the North Country did not follow any herds. They lived in the North Country. They were settled. They had seasonal homes that they may have gone to, like lake homes or wild ricing home camps where you went off for a couple of weeks, like people do to deer camp up here in the UP, going to deer camp for a couple of weeks, and then you come back to your home base. You have winter homes, but you're not wandering around the landscape. Okay, so that's got to get rid of that that concept that tribal people, hunter-gatherers, are nomadic, because most are not. Most are very rooted to a particular land, and that's where this traditional ecological knowledge comes from. And TEK is also based off of when you're interacting with your relations, you respond with reciprocity, gratitude, and humility for the gifts that those relations give us, those gifts that sustain our life. With a stewardship or particularly a management approach, this sort of thing that you've seen on the screen is justified by that paternalistic principle, or by the idea that we are managing these animals for their own good, or we need to conduct studies in order to understand how we manage these animals for their own good. So it justifies and rationalizes treatment of our relatives in this way, where we think it's okay to ban them. We think it's okay to put GPS backpacks on them. We think it's okay to attach antennas to them. And though some animals do die in the process of being radio collared, or, you know, when they have the anesthesia in order for this to happen, some never come out of it. Though we know this happens, we consider it's for the good of the species as a whole. And so we conduct study after study after study for decades after decade after decade. And even though we know how we should be relating to these animals, the problem isn't that we don't know this. The problem is the will to implement the policies that are necessary, right? Still, we keep up with the studies. And this is what the resource management and stewardship mentality can justify, rationalize, and say, you know, this is okay because we're doing it for their own good. There's a story I have of when I was living, or when we were living over by Lance in the Upper Peninsula here of Michigan, and we went into Lance and along the bay there, Lance Bay. Evidently, Lance is French for the bay, so we're talking about the Bay. But anyway, that aside, there are frequently swans in the bay there, and as we were going around on the road, I looked over and I'm like, oh, look, there's a couple of swans. I'm like, oh my goodness. There was one swan that had a white thing around his neck or her neck. And she kept trying to she had her beak under and trying to get it off and plucking at it, and really just could tell it was really bothering her and really frustrating her. And we're like, what should we do? And so we decided, well, let's get to the DNR right away, because they'll want to come out and help the swan, because evidently she's gotten her neck caught into something. Who knows what it is? So we went down there to the DNR office, and I went in and told them there's a swan in distress in the bag. He's trying to get this white band that she's got on her neck off of her. And they said, is it a white band? You know what that is? They said that she's not caught on anything. That's a band we've put on her. If you go back, she said, the person said enthusiastically, who was behind the counter, if you go back and get the number and bring that number here, we can tell you all about that swan's life. There was no concern that the swan didn't want that around her collar. It was like, oh, never mind, that's not, a piece of trash. It's something we deliberately put on her. And though it's distressing her and disturbing her, it's part of our scientific studies, part of our management studies. So go back and we can tell you all about that swan. And I'm like, I can tell you something about that swan right now. I can tell you she's in distress, right? I don't need to know what the rest of her life history is. I know she needs help. But that was it. That was all that there was. And that's part of where that father knows best attitude. We're doing this for the good of the species. We have a right to do this. We are entitled to do this because we think we need to do this for our studies. That's what that all justified and rationalized. Just another example, of course, of how we feel we can treat our animal relatives based off of these philosophical prerogatives. These are just some more examples of ways in which the management ethos, the management philosophy, and stewardship philosophy, again, all for the good of these animals, we justify these sort of things, that it's okay to do this. So here are some examples, but we do other things like radio tracking, GPS, cameras, drones that follow them, heat sensors that can track where the animals are. There's even a database that works with the International Space Station and satellites to keep track of certain animals who have been tagged in this way with the appropriate technology that they can do this. And there's a whole database that documents where these individual animals who are, have the technology that's needed to track them in this way, where they are at any given time and where they have been, and their whole life patterns are all right there. There's no respect for the privacy of these animals, not even talking about the physical discomfort or the fact that some die during this process of these radio collars and whatnot being attached to them. We have no respect for the privacy of these animals. Now, I'm, as much as anyone, am fascinated by what they learn by this. I love to learn about animals, but people used to learn this information by being a member of the community that those animals were a part of, right? And learning the individual animals. And there are scientists, of course, doing that too. We'll take a look at a couple of them at the end of this part 2 here. But the idea is, from a relatives and all our relatives philosophy, would you do this to your grandma? Would you do this to your sister, your brother, your uncle, your aunt, your cousins? Would you do something like this and then watch their movements everywhere they went? There's a lack of respect here. That's justified by, well, we're doing it for their own good so that we can protect their habitat, or we can do this or we can do that. But we already know what we need to do, right? It's about getting the will behind it, but instead we continue to perpetuate attitudes that we can treat animals in this way, and that it's okay to do that. Of course, there's dangers. Poachers can get a hold of these surveillance footages too and find out, okay, this is where this animal is at. That's where that animal is at. So, there's things like that to also consider. It's really interesting to point out the similarity to colonialism as well, because while a lot of these studies are done so that people are saying we need to protect their habitat, that sort of thing, what's happening is people are getting to understand, one, how many of those animals there are, two, through the tracking, exactly what their territories are. And in colonialism, typically, that's kind of the triad, the whole census, map, museum. When a colonial government is coming in, first thing they want to know is, well, how many indigenous peoples are there? Then they want to know, what territories do those indigenous peoples identify with? And then they come in and they take the land through legal or illegal means. And then, pretty soon you find yourself, relegated to a museum kind of idea, that you no longer, in other words, you no longer exist as a sovereign and independent people. You have been taken control of by the colonial government. So I can't help but see again similarities to colonialism with the animal surveillance state. You know, learning how many animals there are, learning what territory they claim, and all being done by people, many people who honestly care about these animals. They just haven't thought thoroughly through what's happening. And then frequently it's often used to herd people into reservations or, you know, wildlife reserves or preserves, all of which are good, but really think about what then it also allows to happen, right? And there's just so much we could go into with this, but I just want you to kind of think for a while on that similarity to the colonial triad: census, map, or relegated to a museum. Alice Walker, a very famous African-American novelist, she writes, "The animals of the world exist for their own reasons. They were not made for humans any more than black people were made for white or women created for men." So this idea that Alice Walker is echoing, which you will find echoed in Indigenous African philosophies as well. She's stating it as an African-American novelist. Like I said, this you'll find in Indigenous African philosophies as well as Indigenous philosophies around the world. That animals exist for their own reasons. We do not have a right to be doing this animal surveillance state because that is a disrespecting of our relatives. We wouldn't do this to our family. Why? So how could we do this to our other than human family here? They were not created for us. They were created for themselves. They exist for their own reasons. By contrast, I want to talk a little bit about the Anishinaabe perspective with wolves. I'll mention this in another lecture on wolves, but the word for wolf in Anishinaabemowin, or the language of the Anishinaabe, is Mayingan, which a cultural, not a literal, but a cultural translation, according to White Earth Land Recovery Project, is that the wolf is the one sent here by that all-loving spirit to show us the way. And I'll talk more about that in other lectures. But the idea is the wolf is looked to as one of the greatest teachers that we have. And also, of course, in even Western culture, the wolf is looked to as a symbol of wildness. So really we need to ask ourselves, what is wild? What are we talking about when we're talking about wild? According to the Oxford English Dictionary, wild means not under or not submitting to control or restraint. So if we are submitting animals to our control and our surveillance, how wild are we? You know, how much are we intruding on that wildness that they have a right to exist in? Wild also is taking or indisposed to take one's own way, uncontrolled, primarily of animals. And unconfined, unrestricted, resisting control or restraint. This is freedom. This means those who do not submit to authority, those who are not under control, are not under restraint, by authoritarian measures. Wild is to exist as a free person, as a free being. So when we impose all these other things that we rationalize with our wardship principles, our paternalistic, we know best principles and philosophies, we are taking these animals away from the wild nature that as relatives they have as much of a right to as we as human beings do. If you look up the word savage, just to kind of do this, continue this comparison with the colonial ideology, if you look up the word savage, you find that that word that's so associated with all this negativity and all these bad things is also, of course, associated with tribal people and with beastly animals. It just simply means, savage simply means to be of the woods or wild. And think about how the Western culture in defining things that are of the woods or wild is all these cruel, bloodthirsty, horrible things. Think about what that implies for the culture and how that culture with that ideology shapes how people raised in that culture see the world and then go on to interact with the world and where that all leads to. Finally, I want to wrap up this part 2 with pointing out that Western science doesn't have to be done in this way. It doesn't have to approach it from this top-down authoritarian steward or manager perspective. It really can have an all our relations approach. And we have had Western scientists who have this all our relations approach, including somebody like Jane Goodall, who was a secretary who was asked by leading anthropologist Louis Leakey if she would be willing to go to Africa to do just an observation research project on the chimpanzees, and she did. And he chose her specifically and several other women whose name I will mention here in a minute, because he did not want them trained in the scientific way of seeing things. He wanted them to come with a fresh approach that was not already encrusted with all the assumptions and cultural worldviews of Western scientific training. He just wanted them to see these animals as, relate to them on an equal basis, and that's what they did. So Jane Goodall was one of them, and she rocked the Western scientific world with her unscientific approach, but she has taught us so much about chimpanzees, the Western world at least so much about chimpanzees, that the Western world never knew and never would have believed, and she did it through a very much of an all relations approach I'm going to see if they will allow me to become a part of their land community and get to know them as individuals. And through that, she learned so much. And there are other scientists who advocate for this or have done this themselves, including Birute Galdikas, I might be mispronouncing her name, and Diane Fossey, both of whom were hired by Louis Leakey, Birute to go study orangutans and Diane to study gorillas. And Diane, as you know, was assassinated for her work in studying the gorillas. There are other scientists like Mark Bekoff, who is an animal behaviorist. He's retired now, but he kind of is one of the people in the 90s who really led the charge for respecting animals, and he's critiqued science very heavily for how terribly it treats animals. So if you're interested in looking at like ethics and how we should treat animals, from that Western scientific perspective of somebody who is a Western scientist and critiquing the Western scientific perspective, Mark Bekoff is an excellent place to start. Carl Safina is an ecologist who has many of the same critiques Mark Bekoff does, and he writes all about animals. And I think it epitomizes his more recent approach when he said, all my life as a scientist, a Western scientist that is, I've been trained to ask the questions, what? Like, what questions? Like, what does this animal do? What kind of species is it? He says, but I want to start asking the more important question of who is this animal? And that gets right down to that all our relations approach, that democracy of species approach, that traditional ecological knowledge approach that tribal people have had in terms of in trying to learn about their land and the community of the land they exist in. That's the approach that they've used all for millennia. Who are these beings, these relatives of ours that we live, that we share this land with? These relatives of ours who, like us, we all belong to the same land. Who are these people? So I want to end it there for part 2, short and sweet. Just a couple examples of how things can be different according to, or how things develop from how we approach things. Right? If we approach things as managers or as stewards, as people who are put in charge of how do we treat animals, what do we justify and rationalize, as opposed to other ways that we can approach animals and learn, I would not say more than just as much, but learn even more because we see them. If you remember the quote from Avatar, I see you, right? When we can say that to another animal, I see you, then we've made a connection. And we've really striven to understand who they are as beings. All right, we'll continue with part 3, where we will take a look at the democracy of species, which comes from that traditional ecological knowledge approach. Bama P. See you later.